Welcome to Follow Your Curiosity. Ordinary people, extraordinary creativity. Here's how to get unstuck. I'm your host, creativity coach Nancy Norbeck. Let's go. Actor, activist, musician, and artist Michael Broussard joined me back in 2021 to talk about his one-man show, Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor, and what he's learned about destigmatizing trauma abuse through art. A few months ago, he mentioned to me that he's been focusing on pulling the rug out from under himself artistically. He's back today to talk about just what that means and how it's actually been influencing his work all along and his upcoming game show project. We talk about game shows over the years, improv skills, that ability to accept and adapt in the moment as integral to art and to life, how we each are an experiential filter for creativity, the importance of creativity as self-care, and more. Here's my conversation with Michael Broussard. Michael, welcome back to Follow Your Curiosity.
It's really great to be here. I appreciate you having me on to talk about the weird stuff that I do.
Well, and in the vein of weird stuff that you do, you mentioned to me a couple months ago that you have been pulling the rug out from under yourself. And since we've already gone through the usual "were you a creative kid" stuff, so if you're listening and you haven't heard that interview, you might want to go back to that one. I'm curious to know what that looks like for you. What have you been doing to pull the rug out from under yourself?
Well, what's interesting about that is, I feel like I've been doing that more recently, and I'll explain what it means in a second. But earlier this morning, I was thinking about it before this interview, and I realized that I've been doing it for at least 10 years without being aware of it. The idea for me of pulling the rug out from underneath me is allowing things that may be surprising that I have no control over happening while I'm doing a performance. Because there's meat in that. I'm a vegetarian, I won't use meat again. Let's say there's gold in that. There's beauty in that. There's something new that if you haven't, it's something you haven't anticipated. So the show gets more interesting and more exciting, and it feeds me to be able to do what I do. And I realized thinking back that when I did that first show, Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor in 2014, the way I pulled the rug out from underneath myself was I said I'm going to allow people during the show, during breaks in the narrative, to ask me whatever question they want to ask me and to have that discussion. Well, I didn't know what they were going to say or they were going to ask or, could have thrown everything into chaos. But I did that. And the reality is it has made this experience of doing that show for 10 years richer beyond imagining, because people have given me things that have fed back not just into the performance that's happening at the time, but into performances that are subsequent over the last 10 years. Now, you know that recently I did a thing called Wrong Answers Only, where the whole point of that is pull the rug out from underneath you. It had no fixed story. I had photos and I had little goalposts along the way that I could turn to if I felt that I needed them, right? But also, when people ask me questions and when people made comments, I let that turn me this way or turn me that way. And the freedom of that was that the story was true and not true. So if the story has to be true, there's only one way you can answer the questions, really, which is with the truth. But if the story can be true and not true, you can answer them any way, and it can take the narrative in a whole different direction. And that way you're creating this thing along with other people. And, not being in control for somebody like myself can be very scary because, as we've talked about before, I deal with mental health challenges. I manage stuff like that. So it's scary not to know what's going to happen all the time. But I find that the balance of creative possibility outweighs that terror. I still get that terror in the middle of a show, like, my God, where are we now and what's going on? But sometimes that terror feeds into something really interesting, So yeah, that's what it's like. That's what I mean by pulling the rug out from underneath myself, is allowing something not to be pre-scripted, pre-planned, burn down to the last detail what's going to happen. And let's see what happens, because creativity can be a solitary activity. But even then, I think creativity is not a solitary activity, even when you're the one behind the keyboard or the one with the paintbrush or whatever, because everything you're doing is a result of, yes, what's inside you, but what's inside you is also affected by what's outside you and what you've seen. Talk about somebody that I was just thinking about this morning again, Vincent van Gogh. If you look throughout his career as a painter, his focus on different parts of the world and human experience changes. Why? Because he's constantly seeking that thing that is what he wants to do. And in the process of that, he creates all these incredible works that range in stylistically and in subject matter and show us different parts of his soul, his mind. And I think that that is such a great thing for an artist to be able to be like, I let this in and it comes out, but I'm not by myself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. And what well, I have multiple thoughts on all of that, but to start from your most recent comment, and I got to tell you how thrilled I am that I'm not the only one in this conversation who's tripping over pulling the rug out from under yourself. That phrase somehow seems to be trickier
It's bumpy.
to say than you would think.
It's a bumpy rug.
Yeah. But, that whole idea that you're not the same person today that you were yesterday, that you were 2 years ago, that you were 10 years ago, kind of feels like it filters in there, right? Like that's what's going on with Van Gogh. That's what's going on with all of us. Every day we know more stuff. We've had different experiences than we had the day before, even if our days mostly seem routine, get up, go to work, come home, make dinner, go to bed, whatever. But in there, in big ways sometimes and more subtle ways other times, there's still a little bit more. You still don't have the exact same backlog of experiences today that you had yesterday. There's something more in there. And so I think that's part of that too.
And you don't have what's just happened to you until it happens to you. And I know that sounds kind of groovy and spacey, but it's for me, it's very true. You don't have what just happened to you. And if you allow what just happened to you to affect yourself as an artist, I think that can be very, very rich. And of course, there's also the tendency, and we're talking about potentially semi-controlled chaos, right? And that's very scary. It can be very scary at times. So when I'm doing these things in shows, that's happening simultaneously in my brain. I'm looking for handholds and footholds, but I'm also being fed stuff that changes the landscape. So the handholds and footholds are elsewhere now, and striving for that handhold or that foothold that takes you somewhere you weren't aware of when you started. I find a very rich experience. I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk about today is this next thing I'm doing. It's a game show, right? And the thing about game shows for me, I watched them when I was a kid, and I loved them when I was a kid. I watched a lot of them when I was skipping school because I was bullied and I didn't want to be at school. So I was at home watching game shows and soap operas. And the game shows that I love, I can pretty much describe as semi-controlled chaos. If you look at somebody like, okay, you want to talk about totally controlled, look at the original Password and Alan Ludden. He tightly controlled everything, and he was really intense about the rules and how things had to be. And when somebody strayed a little bit, he'd grab them and yank them back with a rope. And I'm not criticizing what he did. That's his personality. That's fine. But you get to later on, right? And you get Match Game.
That's what Match Game,
which is complete chaos, right? The game is
chaos.
so incidental to the show. The game has very little to do with what the show is or why it's funny or why it's fun.
The game is just an excuse to have the show.
The game is an excuse to get a bunch of people together who are going to say weird random things and boobs and are going to just be who they are. I mean, and he was really good at that. He was really good at seeing the chaos and embracing the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And it was beautiful. And they would do things like, Charles coming on as Santa Claus, and something would happen earlier in the week, and all of a sudden it would be a bit at the beginning of the next episode, and it would run through the entire thing. And it would be like improv. Yes, and yes, and yes, and. And the panel would do yes, and about that thing that had happened, even in the current episode, over and over and over again. And that is, he was willing to allow this chaos, this semi-controlled chaos. And I don't think it would have been as good a show, and it certainly would have captured my attention as well if it wasn't semi-controlled chaos. And you talk about Password, Super Password, which is several versions down the line in the 80s with Bert Convy. That was not as much as Match Game, but it was in many ways semi-controlled chaos, because Bert Convy, who was the host, he was willing to go with the flow. He was nothing like Alan Ludden. In fact, he went with the flow so much that every once in a while, instead of prompting a contestant, he would accidentally, in the middle of a game, blurt out the solution. And one of the greatest things are those times when they come back from commercial and he has gaffer's tape over his mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can't trust Bert. And it's and he has people like Betty White on, who, of course, is just very little controlled chaos.
Right.
And we love her for that. She's a total chaos agent. Pat Sajak on Wheel of Fortune almost didn't get the job because he was too much of a chaos agent. He wasn't behaving like a normal game show host should be behaving. He was being too out there. And you get Pat Sajak on Super Password, and Bert says, "So have any exciting things happened on Wheel of Fortune lately, Pat?" And Pat says, "Well, nobody's been impaled on the wheel or anything lately, but..." And that's fantastic, right? And I know this sounds weird, but all this stuff in my mind, there's this string and it all connects together, man. Like this connects to everything. This connects to the next thing I'm going to do after the game show, which is going to be, whoa, I am so excited about that. And it's forming little by little. All I can tell you right now is that it is called My Brain Hurts. And it is going to be a narrative with no foreseeable ending.
Oh, boy.
In chapters.
Oh, boy.
And I'm going to allow for interaction. I'm going to go into it with a few goalposts maybe in each chapter, but I don't know where I'm going. And it's going to be real, and it's going to be fictional, and it's going to be schlock horror, and it's going to be sci-fi, and it's going to be, everything. Who knows? All my music influences, anything, right? So I'm finding everything I'm doing, the deeper I get into this idea of semi-controlled chaos, pulling the rug from underneath myself and saying, what'll happen? Let's see. I find that this is such a rich artistic area for me. And I'll refer back to that first show back in 2014. I talked to my therapist about doing it, and she's like, "Oh, I'm worried about what's going to happen because you're allowing sort of this open dialogue." And I'm like, I can't think any other way. My brain is like that. So I'm this really strange mix of, I have trauma, therefore I need to control circumstances around me. But as an artist, if I totally control circumstances around me, my art isn't as good.
Right.
So it's a combination of utter total terror and complete and total joy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to say for younger folks who are listening, before, if you've never heard of Match Game or any of these other things, you can find them online. Match Game is like the quintessential bit of the 1970s, I swear. It was just like a celebrity sort of quiz show, but anything went, and usually with at least double entendre, and just, I suspect most of them were at least a little tipsy a lot of the time.
Oh, you don't have to suspect. There was a retrospective on Match Game some years back, and it was when Brett Summers was still with us, and she talked about it. And she's like,
Okay, well,
yeah, there was a lot of alcohol on set.
I'm not at all surprised by that. But if you really want the 70s in a nutshell, it's never occurred to me before this, but Match Game is probably that. So, very, very much of its time and a different beast from the 80s. You can definitely see a contrast in what the 70s and 80s were like comparing Match Game to any game show from the 80s. I didn't know that Pat Sajak was such a loose cannon either. I thought quite the opposite.
Yeah, he almost didn't get the job. He almost didn't get the job because they were like, this is not what we're looking for.
Yeah.
And for some reason, somebody was smart enough to say, yeah, but this is what we need. And I think that that's great.
Well, the other thing that I don't want to lose track of is that what you're talking about with how all of this has influenced, and I think this is really what we mean when we talk about being influenced, is that like each one of us has, obviously we're all different people, and we all have different experiences, but I don't think we usually think about that in practical terms, in terms of what that happens or what that means, and therefore what happens in the creative process or, life itself. In many ways, like we are all, to be the geeks that we are, I'm thinking of that line from The Five Doctors, a man is the sum of his memories. It's the same kind of thing, right? We are all the sum of our experiences. And so all of those things come together in us in a way that they don't in anybody else, because nobody else has had the precise same set of experiences that we have. And we are kind of the ones who are filtering and integrating all of that in whatever we do. It all, comes together in us and in our work in that unique way, because that's basically, what we are. I hope that made sense. I'm trying to think of a good metaphor for that. But yeah, that's why, years ago when after the, what was it called? The 12th Doctor episodes, was it Before the Flood and Under Something? I can't remember the titles quite.
Yeah,
right
I'm not good with titles. I'm good with stories.
Yeah, it was the one that had the underwater base with 12 and Clara, and then there was this character called the Fisher King, and I spent the whole episode going, does he really mean Fisher like fisherman, like the legend, or is he playing with Fisher like a crack? And I mentioned that in an email to Rachel Pollack, and I watched the credits and I saw that it was the regular, fisherman type Fisher. But I'd mentioned it to Rachel Pollack in an email, and she said, I know exactly what the Fisher King is, meaning the crack. And she said, but I can't use it because it's your idea. And I said, Rachel, look, the odds that you and I would do the same thing with those 3 words are so incredibly slim that you should feel free to go and do what you want to do with it. And if I figure out what I might want to do with it, I'll do that. And, because you're never going to come up with the same stuff. You're just not ever going to come up with the same thing. And that's why her range of knowledge and experience was also immense, but completely different than what I would have brought to that idea. There's no way that they ever would have been remotely the same, unless I let myself read that book before I come up with an idea. And at this point, it's been long enough that perhaps I won't come up with an idea. But that was the only catch. I can't read her book until I've decided if I'm going to use that idea. But, you are never going to come up with the same 2 ideas out of the same prompt. You just aren't.
Out of the same prompt, exactly. And to structure my storytelling as not dependent upon, but influenced by essentially prompts from other humans, helps me do just what you're talking about. Like, who knows what they were talking about when they said it, or who knows what answer they thought they were going to get, because that comes from their experience, right? Or that comes from everything, as you just said, of their lives and everything they've taken in, of everybody else that they know and everything else that they've experienced. The other interesting thing about the Fisher King, of course, it could also have been a reference to Terry Gilliam
Mm-hmm.
and the Fisher King, which is a
Right.
wonderful film. Wonderful Terry. So there's a million different ways. And that goes back to every single person who uses these pieces is going to experience them in different ways and is going to, may mean them in a particular way. But that's not how it's going to get received necessarily by different people with different experiences and different backgrounds. And so there's this infinite possibility of art, whatever art that is, sometimes based on the same things you overhear.
Right.
Or the same things you read, or the same things you watch, or the same painting that you see. And that, again, we're back to pulling the rug out from underneath myself, is saying, okay, I'm letting all this impact me, but not, there's a way that it has impacted me in the past, certainly, where you're writing or you're working on a piece and you're in your mode working on a piece and you do your thing and you're by yourself and you write the piece and then you take the piece out into the world, right? And there's a difference between that and being confronted with those things that potentially influence this piece you made and then presented, being confronted with those when you have a framework for a piece and those happen in real time. And my brain may consider something I've read or something I've seen for a long time before it becomes a thing. Right. Well, in that moment, you don't have a long time. And that is a kind of real-time artistic expression that I think is fantastic, because it is the most immediate to me artistic dialogue I can have with other people, where I am just unfiltered. I don't have time to filter. I don't have the opportunity to filter.
Right.
And so everything comes out genuine. And again, it goes back to the way I've done shows for years, which is, even with all these different storytelling shows I've done, I've never written a script to any of these things. And that has to do with the fact that I tell my stories with a more genuine tone when I am telling them and am in a room with other people at that moment and hearing what they have to say, and it comes out real. It comes out now. Mm-hmm. It sounds out now. It sounds a bit like I'm Albert Brooks and is like it's like the New Age character he used to play in the 70s and 60s. But it comes out now, man. And it's just so cool. It's just so fantastic. And it gives me this endless open field of possibility. So I have these ideas and I have my little phone app and I type all these things in, and these things over time become different things and they get revised before they ever start actually they're being developed over there, right? But they're developing my brain too, and that's how they're being developed, back and forth, like conversation with my phone. But they don't really become the thing until they're out there in the world.
Right.
They don't become the thing until then. And it's the same thing. I mean, if you look at, I will give the example of Hedwig and the Angry Inch because I absolutely love it, right? Hedwig was majorly revised when it went from off-Broadway to Broadway. It didn't change the heart of the story. It just illuminated some things. And it just made some things stronger. And this was the obvious result of the person who created it looking at how people had responded to the piece over decades and saying, okay, here's this thing, here's that thing. We're going to give it a little more of this, a little more explanation of that, a little more emotion here. And we're going to use this line to go into this song instead of that line we used to use to go into this song. So they're going to feel this relationship more. Well, that's like a slow motion version of what I'm talking about, which is just like, oh my God, you're here. And what's happening now? And what's going on now? The thing that's going to be interesting for the piece that I've got coming up that I'm going to be working on for the next thing after I do this, which I told you that my brain hurts thing, is that it is going to be a combination of not just other people's ideas and thoughts and like, not ideas, but like input as I'm doing the piece. And well, yeah, ideas as well. They may have thoughts and ideas that get integrated in because of the experience that we create something together. But I'm also getting very deep into the things I can do with my production software, with overlays and slideshows and animations and things like that. So I'm going to have a bag full of those available to me that I can deploy when it's appropriate.
Right.
And who knows when it'll be appropriate. But the moment will come up and I can't anticipate what that appropriate moment will be. My brain will just go, ding, time for the slow motion thing of a guy falling off a building. We got that now. Time for the brain scans. We've got that now.
Yeah.
Time for the silly thing. Time for the, time for the thing that looks like a Doctor Who special effect from 1974.
Oh, excellent.
There's always Doctor Who.
Of course. Of course.
There's always Doctor Who. It's scary, but it's scary in a way that I find artistically exciting.
Yeah. And I keep thinking as you're talking that the really cool thing about the way you work is that you end up with a show that is never the same thing twice. And that's true even of, a scripted Broadway play, because something different is going to happen all the time. But that's much less of, never the same thing twice than what you're doing. Because everything that happens when you're interacting with the audience, you can't predict where it's going to go. You can't predict where it's going to make you turn left instead of right. You have no idea where you're going to end up. So it's a little bit like improv every time, which does mean that it's more exciting for you. I mean, when you're doing the same thing over and over, and I do not mean this to sound like I am dissing people who do Broadway shows or anything like that in any way, because I know that it's not really the same thing for them, and that's part of why they love it. But if you were to set out to try to recreate the same thing every time, either you would get really frustrated because that's not really all that possible, or you'd get really bored. Because yes, I know how to do this. It's like falling off a log, but it's like falling off a log. It's the same thing every time. And now what's in this for me? People love it, but what, I need to go do something else. I need a new challenge, whatever. And that doesn't mean that you're going to do that same show forever because it is so significantly different every time, but it does give it more longevity, and it probably spurs plenty of other ideas in the process. And having been to several of your shows, I know there have been moments where people have asked you a question that has completely changed the way you've seen your own story, because it's something that has never crossed your mind before. And so you've got that whole extra layer of insight. So it's changing you as well as changing where the show goes. And that is so fabulously dynamic. It's really very cool.
And did you touch on something very interesting there? Because it's not just changing me artistically. It's
Right.
changing my personal view of myself, which I take forward from the art and into my life, and it feeds my life in a positive way. And it makes me have conversations with my therapist that never would have occurred to me. It's a new revelation. It's a new growth point. I'm so grateful to all of the people over the years of things that I've done who, through their input and their interaction with each show that I've done, have given me new opportunities for personal growth. Not just artistic growth, but personal growth, but growth in the way I see the world, the way I see myself, the way I heal, the way I look at other people, the way I show compassion and kindness, the way I understand and listen. I think understanding, the hallmark of understanding is listening, and it's really listening. A lot of people hear people talk, but they don't listen to the degree that they put aside their personal preconceptions of what the person is talking about. There's the old saw of like, you're listening to reply and not listening to actually understand. And yeah, that's part of what I'm saying. And part of what I'm saying also is, even when you're listening to understand, sometimes it's hard to go the extra step of putting aside the preconceived notions in your head, even though you're actually listening, to hear something that may contradict or challenge those preconceived notions in your head. It's why I look to the world and people in my life to teach me about their experience. We're both on Blue Sky. I love Blue Sky. One of the things I love about Blue Sky is all the different feeds. I follow the Black Sky feed. I follow the Trans Streamline. I follow a number of different ones because honestly, I want to know what is going on for people from their perspective. And I want to learn from that because you have to take somebody not as a version of what you conceive them to be or you conceive their experience to be, but as a version of what they're actually going through. And that takes putting aside your ego completely and putting aside all the things you think you know. The reality is, as a straight cis white guy, I have not experienced what it's like to be in these marginalized groups. I listen because that's the only way that I will understand. And even then, there's no way that I will understand it to the degree that I am experiencing it.
Right.
And taking people at their face value and supporting them the way they want to be supported is tantamount to me. You tell me what you need. You tell me what's tough for you, what's difficult for you. You tell me, and you know what? I'm not always going to put the burden on you to tell me how I can help, because that's sometimes asking additional labor from people who are already struggling. I am going to put the burden on myself to learn and to figure it out. Take people from where they're coming from. And there's a lot of talk, on social media and in general about different communities and conflicts that arise. And it seems to me that conflicts most often arise simply because people aren't listening.
Right.
They just aren't listening.
Right. Or they think that the way they would react in a certain situation is the way everyone would react in a certain situation. I just saw a conversation like that online, and I was just like, okay, so you had X experience and it was really good for you, and that's great, and therefore you think that it would be good for anybody, and that's not necessarily so great. You can't expect that, it helped to heal your trauma when it could actually re-traumatize somebody else because you are not them. And so I think that's one of the most common things. And it's very natural, right? We want to try to relate it to ourselves because it helps us understand it. But we still need to acknowledge that what we would do and how it would feel to us is not necessarily how it would feel to someone else or what it would do to them, and leave room for, okay, this is how I think it would be for me, but I see what you're saying. And it's that last part that I think we lose. And we lose it because we really, really don't listen. And I know I've said this multiple times before, but doing this show has made me a better listener and made me realize how much I didn't listen before and how much people around me don't listen, because it's just, and I mean, I'm not saying that I'm perfect about it. I do not listen perfectly all the time. If, my family is going on about a thing that I've heard 16 times before, I'm going to tune it out just like everybody else is, but I am more aware of it now. So that has been an unexpected gift of doing this, is to notice that. But then once you notice it, you become much more frustrated with people who aren't listening. It's a little ironic.
Oh my goodness. Yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that makes you good at this, of course, is that you are such a good listener. And it's like having a conversation with somebody, the best kind of conversation with somebody, as opposed to you speak, they speak, you speak, they speak, and all that thing. This is something where you're saying things and I'm like, oh, okay. And I can hear from the way you respond that you're hearing me too. And I think that that's such an important thing, because you get people who do this kind of thing, like a podcast, who have their predetermined idea of what they're going to do. And you can tell sometimes that these people don't listen.
Mm-hmm.
And you are one of the people who listens. And that's why this is such a good forum, I think, for people. And I truly appreciate that it's here for that very reason.
Well, thank you. It's actually I was thinking of this when I was talking before about never the same show twice. It's kind of the same thing with me. If I came into this with just a preconceived list of questions, and it was just I ask a question, you answer, I ask another question, you answer, I would be really bored. I did it that way for a while, and then I ran out of questions one day and had to start listening and said, hey, you know what? This is actually more interesting and much better. And it makes it more interesting for me. It's kind of like podcast improv. I don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
I have no idea. Generally speaking, I start out with one question. It's the one I start with. Depending on who it is, I may or have one or two other things that I really hope we can get to. But otherwise, it's going wherever it's going to go. And that's much more interesting for me and for everybody else, I think.
You talked about improv earlier as well. And I wanted to say one of the things that fed into me doing what I do is the fact that I took improv classes with two of the best improv people who at the time were both in Philly, but they're not in Philly anymore. And they were the team members of a particular improv duo, the Kristen and Amy show, of which they are still. And I got to learn so many things that I wouldn't probably have learned quite as well had these people not been so good at what they do and at their ability to teach and to translate that into actionable things that we could do to learn how to get those things happening in our minds and our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And that opened up my idea of what storytelling can be. Because, well, from the second teacher, what I learned, which was wonderful, was improv does not need to be funny. And if you're trying to be funny, you're doing it wrong. It may be funny sometimes, but if you're trying to be funny, you're doing it wrong. You're building off of the last person and they're building off of you. And this teacher in particular was very strong in like, sometimes you can do something improvisational that is not funny at all. It can be revelatory and interesting and fascinating and powerful, but not necessarily funny. Improv doesn't mean funny. So when, I was doing that show Wrong Answers Only, and I'm improving off of this sort of artificial idea of who my parents were, because these people aren't my real parents, but suddenly they're my parents. I'm improving off of what I knew of them, and I'm improving off of what somebody just asked me, and I'm improving what somebody told me about their background. And it's not funny. In fact, some of it was kind of heartbreaking, certainly for me. But I don't think I would know that as well had I just, and I'm not putting down the theater classes I had. I had fantastic theater classes, scene study and all that, and voice and all that stuff. But if I had not had the improv classes, I don't think I would have opened myself up to all these possibilities that feed absolutely everything I do. And to get back to the game show thing, game show host was something I thought about for a long time, like, oh, this is a dream in my life that will never happen because no one's going to hire me to do this. And I joke about the fact that, Pat Sajak was retiring, and I'm surprised and shocked and horrified and offended that I didn't get a call. Because my wife Christy and I, we'll sit and we'll watch Wheel of Fortune, and she'll be like, you can do this. You guys tell the same jokes. And sometimes I'll tell the joke before he tells it.
Oh, that's
and then
funny.
She'll be like, oh, that's one of your jokes. He stole that from you. Or the way he reacted to that person. And I thought of that as something like, an unachievable thing, right? Because no one's going to hire me to do this. And then suddenly it hit me, what the hell? Why am I not just doing this for myself? Why am I not creating this thing for myself and creating this thing where I can bring people in and have them talk about who they are and have them engage in these games, these fun little games, which remind them of other game shows and stuff like that, and let them kind of improv their way through the experience. Because in a lot of ways, that's what a lot of these game shows are. People get through them however they get through them by figuring things out as they go.
Right.
And things happen sometimes. God, I don't even. I think it was the last week of Wheel of Fortune, there was a puzzle, and I think they would have normally edited this out, but it was reminiscent of something that had happened decades before in another game show. And I don't remember what the actual puzzle answer was, but the guy guessed right in the butt. And it was this wonderful explosion, and Pat was just like, he just like stood there and was like, what do I do now? And then he started laughing. And I know that they edit these shows to take certain things out. Mm-hmm. But I feel like the last week was just like all bets are off. And it became the joke of the show. And that's part of what being a good improver is. Mm-hmm. Being more than just a funny host is working with what happens.
Right.
And finding it and expanding it and having fun with the other people with it, and with them from where they're coming from and from where you're coming from, and the charm of that. I mean, every game show host, every one of the good ones, in my opinion, was a freaking improv artist. Mm-hmm. They were out there going, what am I going to get today to work with? And how do I do that? And the best ones, they did that. And we go back to Match Game, you had a whole ton of great improv artists. One of my favorite things that would happen on Match Game is where they would come up with a bit that they did at the beginning of an episode or something that had nothing to do with the game. They would just come out on like Charles Nelson Riley dressed in a robe or something like that, or whatever. And there were several times where they would get to the end of where the bit was, and Charles would be like, so the bit didn't work out quite like I thought it would, and there weren't as many laughs. But that's all I got. And that would be the biggest laugh of the entire episode.
Right.
Was like acknowledging that he was doing a bit and bringing everybody in to this reality and this suspended reality, And that's what I love. I love reality and suspended reality. Like, you're going to go and you're going to see me do my thing, whether it's in the game show or this My Brain Hurts thing or my Versus for a What the Fuck World or whatever they are. But like, that's what it is. It's this artificial world that is also real, because real people are playing in it, but anything can happen.
Right.
Anything can happen.
Right. And what I keep thinking as you're saying this is that I really believe that improv is a vital life skill, that we would all be so much better at life if we learned improv as kids, because basically that's what improv teaches, is to accept what happens and roll with it. And I kind of think I knew this before I read Keith Johnstone's Improv about 2 years ago, but when I read that book, and it's a dense book, but it is a fascinating book. And I just, the whole time I was reading it, I thought, this is like probably the best book on creativity I've ever read, certainly that was ever written, I suspect. But, literally this man is telling you how to get through life. It's life skills as much as it's theater skills. Theater skills is just kind of like super applied life skills. And it was amazing. I mean, absolutely amazing. I mean, it was basically like reading, psychological Aikido, take the energy of the situation and roll with it and use it instead of letting it knock you down, whatever your partner throws at you, use that energy. I mean, in that situation, more against your partner, but still, it's like how to have that mental dexterity to not get stuck in, man, my bit didn't work, and now I'm upset and I'm sad and I'm going to ruin the rest of the Match Game show because I'm going to sulk over here because my bit didn't work. I mean, the difference in energy between that and what you were describing is immense. And, if we all felt like we had the freedom to be like, well, hey, I was trying this thing. It didn't work, bummer, didn't work, but hey, now and now we can play with that and we can, see what happens next, whether it's, a conversation with your boss or your partner or your kid or whatever. It would be so much so freeing compared to where a lot of us get hung up and stuck.
And it's when people get hung up and stuck, and I've certainly dealt with that in my life, getting hung up and stuck and not being able to move forward because something knocked me back. And this is not to minimize at all the reality of trauma and things like that, which sometimes you do get temporarily stuck, and that's life and that's reality. And I respect people who are able to, who deal with that, and they deal with it whatever way they deal with it. And if they can't move forward from there, that's also understandable. But there's the value in being able to, and you talked about Aikido, which is redirection. I'm pretty sure Aikido is redirection of force.
Right.
I think. And the idea of redirection of force is fabulous, because that's a great metaphor for this idea of having everybody in on the joke. Everybody knows it's a show. When I get on screen and I do these Zoom things, these storytelling shows, everybody knows it's a show. There's not this pretense that it's not a show, And I think once you let people in on that, they have fun. They enjoy themselves. And they get to experience the moments that aren't necessarily funny or fun on a deeper level as well, because they're part of it. And they feel an ownership. That is so important, to feel an ownership to the work. Because yes, the work is mine, but the work is also my audience, theirs. Feeling an ownership to the thing makes people enjoy it more, makes people get more out of it, makes people feel like they have agency in their own lives, And I think that is so very important, to feel that you have agency. And there are times when it's really hard to have agency, and it's hard to feel you have agency. And I remember those times, and they're tough sometimes. And I've gone through them. And sometimes you get the wind knocked out of you and you can't do anything, and you just sit back and you sit there. Your agency in that moment, you do have agency. Actually, you know what? You have the agency to do this. I can't do anything right now. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to watch my favorite comfort movie or comfort TV show, or I'm going to listen to my comfort music. And that's agency too. The agency to acknowledge, I cannot process this now. I need to do something for myself. And that's all agency too.
And it's
huge. I think all that stuff should be respected as agency. Not just, I have agency, therefore I'll keep pushing through, which is the screwed up American ideal of like, no matter what happens to me, I keep going. I'm like, sometimes you need to sit back. And that's an intelligent choice,
Right. That's why I said it's huge, because so many of us are trained to think that that's not an option. So sometimes the real power move is saying, yeah, you know what? I'm out right now. I need to get away from whatever this situation is and go take care of myself for a while, and I'll be back when I'm feeling up to handling it. Sometimes, depending on the situation, you don't really have that luxury, but if you do, making that choice is a power move.
And you know what? Gen Z is so great at this.
Oh, yes.
I have learned so much from Gen Zers, if you want to use all the Gen things. But Gen Zers, I just admire them so much, because they're not willing to put up with this, I will devote myself to my job to the degree that I will have no life. They're like, you have time? Take the time. It belongs to you. Take your personal time off. Take your sick time. It belongs to you. And it's valid to have a mental health day. It is valid. If you want to do that, do that. And I think that a lot of employers are getting stopped up short, by this, and they don't know what to do with it, because they're older people who are used to all their employees being locked into we must. And they look at younger people who they've hired going, oh, well, they're not devoted the way that I'm devoted. And I'm like, yeah, but you own the company.
Right.
You're benefiting from your devotion. They're just getting paid. They're not getting any of that benefit. And it's so true that it's healthy to have things other than your job in your life. We had a conversation, Christine, about this just yesterday. I was, I'm having people who apply for the game show send me 3 interesting things about themselves, right? To date, nobody sent me their job. And I love that.
Excellent.
Because that's such a Oh, you're at a party. What do you do?
I was
Well,
just
what I
thinking that.
do and what I do for a living are different things. My job is not me. Sometimes
Right.
people's job is them, but sometimes it's not. And I had this conversation with her yesterday. And I said, I've been, having people come in for orientations, and I'm not asking them, where they're from, and I'm not asking them what their job is. But it doesn't seem relevant to me where they're from or what their job is unless it's relevant to them. And
Mm-hmm.
I said, do you think that's a mistake? Because game show hosts always do that. And she says, I think you should do what you do. And she's right. I should do what I do. And unless somebody's really tied to where they come from and they want to talk about it, that's great. But I got a guy who wants to talk about the fact that his dog eats chicken feet. That's way better than where are you from or what do you do for a living or whatever,
Yeah, that's much more interesting.
The guy who was married to his husband for a full year before they lived in the same country.
Oh, wow.
It's great stuff. It's fabulous. And it's so human. So I don't have to be locked into what people think is important.
Right.
I can be, what do you think is important? You tell me what's important to you, and let's have that conversation.
Yeah.
And in the shows, like the show I got coming up and all the other storytelling shows, people are going to react from their point of view and how it affects them and what matters to them. And something I say that I know where it's coming from underneath me may not say that to them at all,
Mm-hmm.
and may touch off something else inside them that then comes back around and the loop goes, ooh, I never saw that way.
Yeah.
And now I see both somebody else's perspective and my own perspective in a different way. And that's great. I love it. Let's improv. Let's pull that rug out. Let's just do that.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's a broadening experience for everybody, and it's not passive because something is happening inside you as you experience it. So, I think I've never thought about this before, but I think there's an awful lot of passivity built into our culture. You get up, you go to work, and whatever happens to you at work, you largely have to just put up with. You come home, you have dinner, depending on your domestic situation, some other stuff might happen. But a lot of us, it's trained into us to be kind of passive and just be like, okay, well, that was terrible, but I can't really do anything about it. So I'm going to go on and, hope that it gets better at work or in my relationship or whatever the next time. And that's not really a great way to go through life. We forget that we have agency. We forget that we can make choices. We forget that there are other options. I think we'd all be better off if we didn't forget those things.
Absolutely. And it can be hard to realize at times because everything gets to be too much. Mm-hmm. So when somebody doesn't realize that, and me included, I get it.
Right.
The revelation of it is the key to everything. And I was thinking about this earlier today, and I was like, what would I do if I won the lottery? Well, you know what? The thing you would do if you won the lottery is the thing you should do. Not like go on a big trip or whatever. If I won the lottery, and I was thinking, if I won the lottery, I'd spend more time on my music. Well, just spend more time on your music.
Yeah.
Just do it. Don't wait until circumstances change to make it right. Just spend more time on your music. And your music may not be for public consumption, or whatever art may not be for public consumption. It may just be for yourself. But if you were going to do the thing and your heart wants to do the thing, whether it's draw or paint or dance or whatever it is, do it because it makes you happy. And don't wait for somebody to give you permission.
Right. We can give ourselves permission. And a lot of people get blocked because they think they have to wait for permission.
I ain't waiting.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Just spend more time on your music now. Even if it's only an extra 5 minutes a day, go spend more time on your music now. It can grow over time. It may turn into something else. It doesn't matter. Just go do the thing. Yeah.
You have these wonderful workshops that you do about play. Mm-hmm. And I think that just strikes at the root of this entire thing, right at the heart of this entire thing. We forget how to play. And we think that we can't play until we give ourselves permission to play by doing a certain amount of things we don't want to do. Play.
Or we think we need permission to play in the first place. That's why I called that workshop Permission to Play.
Right.
We're adults. We're not kids. We're not supposed to play. Yeah, I think that's wrong. I think we are supposed to play. I think when we get play trained out of us, that's when something, that's what we're not supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as artists, you have to give yourself permission to play, which is why I think a lot of artists that I know have that little kid much louder inside of themselves.
Yes.
And I love that loud little kid who will not be shouted down.
Yes.
Because he's just they are just happy and loud, and they don't care how loud they are, and they're like, this is great.
Well, and that's the irony, right? We say that all that stuff is childish, and then we avoid it, and we wonder where our creativity went. Like, really?
Right.
It's kind of right there in front of your face.
Yeah.
Because if you look at kids and the way that they create, it never stops. They never stop asking questions. They never stop coming up with stuff until someone tells them they're not allowed to do that anymore. And that's why, and I want to write or do something more with this, but the NASA study that looked at kids and gave kids the same test for creativity that they gave their engineers way, way back a good couple decades ago, and then followed them and watched what happens when they gave that test to 5-year-olds. Like 98% of those kids scored as creative geniuses. 98%. I'm pretty sure that's the right number. If it's not, it's very close. And then they followed them as they went through school and watched that number drop, which shouldn't really have been a surprise to anybody, but now they had the data to prove it. And to say, hey, look, our schools are doing this. And I don't think it's just school. I think it's the overculture too. It's your parents, your family, your friends. It's all built in there, this message that stuff is for kids. You like playing with Lego? Well, that stuff is for kids. And
I love all my friends who play with Legos. I love all my friends who play with Transformers and collect them. I love all my friends who are into Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I love all my friends. That's probably something that people aren't even into anymore. I don't know. I'm old. I love all my friends, who great people who do nothing but really cool drawings of sharks. I love all my friends who, I love it. I love it.
Yeah. And denying ourselves that stuff that we love is denying ourselves a full life. I don't think that we were put on this planet to be tortured by cultural demands on going to work, especially if it's a job you don't love. If it's a job you do love, then, none of this applies. But, an awful lot of people are in jobs that they do not love and maybe even actively hate because of what they have to do or because of the management style or whatever. That's not a life. And part of the reason that I do what I do is to encourage people to, okay, you may be stuck there for one reason or another. At least give yourself a couple minutes a day to go do the stuff you do love. And, as you work on what you can do to change that other situation, give yourself time to do the stuff you do love, because among other things, it'll keep the creative parts of your brain alive that may help you answer the other question. But it'll also just keep you in that kid space that is more alive than the person you have to be from 8 to 5 every day going into that job, or dealing with that relationship or that set of parents or whatever it is. You need it. Creativity is self-care. It is how you keep those parts of you alive and with you and active in you. And we write it off as a luxury, and it's not. It's a necessity, and that's part of why.
Mm-hmm. I feel myself terribly fortunate that I chose a creative life, and had lots of terrible jobs as well. But I chose a creative life because it is the best thing in my life and gives me the most perspective on my life. And I've certainly been victim to some of the things you talk about over the years. and I got to get straight, and I got to do things the right way, and I got to be the person that, my society expects me to be, and my job expects me to be, and all this other stuff. And just being creative helps me. And, when I say being creative, I don't mean like I'm a creative person and other people are not. We're all creative people in a way, and we can all be creative. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a successful graphic novelist. You don't have to be a successful filmmaker or whatever. Just be creative. Let that out. Like you said, that play, does that 98% of whatever it was of kids who scored so high, that being creative, and you said too also, is going to help you deal with the things in your life that you now have skills that you just reclaimed that you can now apply to these things in your life that may be barriers to you or maybe making your life less enjoyable. And also, I think to some degree, you'll be less likely to want to put up with a less life, a less creative life, and a less joyful life, because creativity is joy and everybody deserves joy. And I am so fortunate that when I do these things, I get to be creative with a bunch of other people.
Yes.
Who get to feed into what I do, and I get to like feed off of what they say. And it's a wonderful gestalt thing. I love that word gestalt. I use it whenever I can because no one uses it. Gestalt. But it's a wonderful thing. And it all goes back to openness, like you're talking about. Let's be open to the creative things. Let's be open to the fun things. Let's be open to just having a good time and playing and not letting people stop us. And I have decided in my life, I'm not letting anybody stop me anymore. And this isn't because I've always known this. This is because I had to grow into it.
Right.
And I've grown into it. And I am so freaking happy because I'm doing that.
Right. Right. And so many of us make the opposite choice. It's a choice, folks. You can choose otherwise. Even if it's 5 minutes a day, you can choose otherwise. So.
And don't let anybody stop you from singing.
Right.
Don't let them, oh, your voice is terrible. Your voice is beautiful. It's your voice. If it's in your head, let it out.
Right. Right. Or painting or drawing or whatever. I talk about how I drew bad stick figure art when I was teaching because that's what I know how to draw. And honestly, I'm pretty sure sometimes it was the highlight of a class because we all had a good laugh at it. Like, yeah, we're going to draw bad stick figures. And then one of my kids decided that some of their heads should explode. And so that became a thing. And yeah.
You gave them a prompt.
Exploding heads, man.
You gave them a creative prompt, man. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. We just ran with it. And it was cool. It was just kind of like, yeah, that's Miss Norbeck's thing. She draws bad stick figure art. So yeah, I mean, and there's joy in bad stick figure art with exploding heads because we all got a good laugh out of it. It was kind of a weird bonding thing with my students. It was great. So
there's also at least one cartoonist who does stick figures. By definition, it's just like, this is what I do, this is what I can do.
Right.
And his little 4-panel cartoons are hilarious and they're brilliant and they're clever and they're insightful. So do what you do, right? There's all this stuff about like gatekeeping art and AI generated art, right?
Right.
Well, they're gatekeeping art because we don't know, we can't draw like they can draw, or we can't paint, or we can't do whatever. And I'm like, you know what? It's not gatekeeping. Pick up a pencil, pick up a pen, draw stick figures, draw whatever you can draw. No one's gatekeeping visual art. No one's saying you have to be just like the guy who has, all these things out in the world and is, successful in the terms that we describe successful. Draw your stick figures, man. Put your little word balloons in them. Nobody's gatekeeping it. Draw because you want to draw.
Which I think is what you're thinking of with the comic, is a wonderful comic.
Yes, exactly what I'm thinking of. Thank you.
Yeah, XKCD. It's amazing. It's fabulous and super thoughtful. And I think it's super thoughtful because the art is so simple. And so there's room to focus a little bit more on the actual words that keep it going. But yeah, he's been doing that forever. And it's fabulous. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, Rachel Pollack drew her own deck of tarot cards and she was not an artist. It's not the greatest art you'll ever see, but it's her art. So, and I say greatest, by whose standard, right? Is it likely to hang in a museum? I don't know. There are things that hang in a museum that I wouldn't have thought would end up in a museum, so maybe it could. I mean, who knows? Who's to say? But it's worth exploring your stuff. And maybe your art is terrible when you start. Maybe if I sat down and drew bad stick figures every day, someday I would end up with really good stick figures. Maybe they would turn into something else. I think you can learn anything if you sit down and decide that you want to. If I took an art class, I might be really surprised at what I could do. I don't know. Same is true for you or anybody.
Yeah. Explore it without particular expectation. The expectation is I'm going to do it. Not the expectation is I'm going to work my ass off to the point that I make myself crazy and I'm in constant physical and moral and emotional pain. No, you just do it because you want to do it and enjoy it and have fun doing it. And who knows what it'll lead to? It may just lead to being happier. My God, what a wonderful thing. And you may just be a happier person. Isn't that nice? You may just be a more centered and a more focused person. Maybe you'll get to learn. Maybe you'll get to find that kid who you left behind on the road somewhere.
Yes.
Won't that be nice?
Yes. And I do want to add, if you take a class, like I mentioned, taking a drawing class, if I took a drawing class and somebody, was especially the instructor was really judgmental about what I was drawing, I would find a different class. Or I would have a long conversation with the instructor and say, hey, look, I'm not here to be Michelangelo. I'm just here to have fun and see what I can do and not to be judged for it.
Right.
And see how they react, because that's part of the agency and the choice that you have too. And you should feel free to exercise it. If you're paying somebody to take a class, they shouldn't be belittling you and judging you for what you're doing. A good teacher will encourage you and understand that not everybody's going to operate at the same level. And not everybody wants to.
I look back at teachers, and I had some wonderful teachers. I had some miserable times at school because of fellow students, but I had some wonderful teachers. And one of them was an English teacher. And every time she would give us a composition assignment, I would turn it into a piece of fiction. And she was so wonderful and encouraging and sweet and kind about it. And she loved it. And I always got A's because I think she was just like, paper. Oh, this person had fun. This is good,
Right.
I wrote some story in response. I forget what the prompt. It was about somebody. It was supposed to be about somebody turning into an animal. So I took my inspiration from all of those Disney movies, like the computer wore tennis shoes and all those things, where like Kurt Russell gets hit by lightning and turns into a computer or turns invisible or whatever. And I got a guy who accidentally turned himself into a rabbit. And there's a point in the story where he says, in the end he ends up foiling a spy plot because of course. And in the end he ends up throwing a rabbit punch. And in parentheses I said, which of course is the only kind of punch a rabbit can throw. And not having a teacher who was just like, I like what you do, just keep doing it. I was just like, I'm going to put all the silly things that I want to put in here just because I want to do it. Right. And I am so thankful to her because she made me feel like being open and free was a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And open and free is really the key to all creativity. The more open and free you can be, the better your work will be. And the more you do it, the more open and free you will become.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, that feels like the perfect place to stop for today. So I love this conversation. I love where we've gone and where we've ended up. So thank you for that.
Me too. You know what it was? It was like one of the shows that I do. I had no idea what you were going to say, and I ended up in conversations I had no idea I was going to be in. Thank you for that.
That's right.
Thank you for that collaboration. This was a great collaboration.
Yes, absolutely. Before we go, when's your game show?
The game show is on September 14th at 3 p.m. Eastern time, in Eastern United States time. It is on Zoom, and I can shoot you the URL, right? Yep, and you can just put it into the podcast. I will shoot you the URL for it. And we're still looking for contestants, and it's an opportunity just to have fun.
Excellent. That's this week's show. Thanks so much to Michael Broussard for joining me and to you for listening. The links for Michael's upcoming game show are in the show notes, and I hope you'll check them out. Please leave a review for this episode. There's a link in your podcast app, so it's really, really easy and will only take a minute. If you enjoyed our conversation, I hope you'll share it with a friend. Thank you so much. If this episode resonated with you, or if you're feeling a little bit less than confident in your creative process right now, join me at The Spark on Substack as we form a community that supports and celebrates each other's creative courage. It's free, and it's also where I'll be adding programs for subscribers and listeners. The link is in your podcast app, so sign up today. See you there, and see you next week. Follow Your Curiosity is produced by me, Nancy Norbeck, with music by Joseph McDade. If you like Follow Your Curiosity, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. It really helps me reach new listeners.